On March 14, 2023, at 9:42 in the morning Pacific Time, Caleb Marsh detected something at the bottom of the Mariana Trench that violated every known principle of deep-sea thermodynamics. The reading made no sense. At 8,200 feet below the surface, where his saturation diving team was conducting routine maintenance on trans-Pacific fiber optic cables, the water temperature held steady at 34 degrees Fahrenheit, exactly as it should. But 900 feet deeper, at coordinates 11 degrees 22 minutes north, 142 degrees 35 minutes east, the sonar showed something producing measurable heat signatures. In the deepest, coldest waters on Earth, something down there was warm. Caleb was 36 years old, a deep-sea technical diver with certification in saturation diving and over 400 logged dives below 1,000 feet. He'd spent 23 days pressurized in the diving bell for this contract, breathing heliox mix, living in a compression chamber the size of a small bathroom with 3 other divers. His body had adapted to pressure equivalent to standing under 240 cars stacked on top of him. This was the western sector of Challenger Deep, the absolute bottom of the known ocean, and nothing in his 14 years of commercial diving had prepared him for what the sonar was showing. "Caleb, you seeing this?" Sienna Park's voice crackled through the internal comms. She was the sonar technician, 29 years old, former Navy submarine specialist, now working commercial contracts because the pay was triple what the military offered. Her monitor displayed a 3-dimensional map of the seafloor below them, and there, clear as day, sat a geometric structure 180 feet in diameter. Perfectly circular. Not a rock formation, not a geological feature. The edges were too clean, too deliberate. Ethan Cross leaned over Sienna's shoulder, his engineering background making him naturally skeptical. "Run the diagnostic again. That's got to be a ghost signal." He was 41, mechanical engineer, the kind of guy who triple-checked everything before trusting it. But the diagnostic came back clean. The structure was real. More than that, it was emitting thermal energy, pulsing in steady intervals every 8 seconds. Maya Torres, the hyperbaric chamber physician assigned to monitor their health during the 23-day saturation period, checked her own instruments. "Biomonitors are stable across the board. Whatever's down there isn't affecting you physiologically. Yet." She added that last word quietly, but they all heard it. Caleb pulled up the mission parameters on his screen. Pacific Link Subsea Incorporated had contracted them for a straightforward job, inspecting and repairing deep-sea cable infrastructure that connected North America to Asia. Billions of dollars in data flowed through these cables every day. The contract was legitimate, the paperwork clean, the payment schedule exactly on time. $180,000 split 4 ways for 23 days of work. Good money, but not unusual for saturation diving at this depth. What was unusual was this. Caleb zoomed in on the thermal signature. The heat readings showed 41 degrees at the structure's outer edge, climbing progressively toward the center. At 9,100 feet, surrounded by water that had been 34 degrees for millions of years, something was generating heat. The second law of thermodynamics stated that heat flows from hot to cold, equalizing over time. Whatever was down there should have cooled to ambient temperature centuries ago, unless it wasn't centuries old, unless it was still active. "We need to report this," Maya said, her medical training making her cautious by nature. "This is outside mission parameters." Caleb stared at the screen. The structure sat 900 feet below their authorized operational depth. Going down there would require 6 hours of careful depressurization procedures, adjusting the gas mix, recalculating decompression schedules. It would also require authorization from topside. He opened the channel to the surface support vessel. "This is Bell 1 calling topside. Shane, you there?" Shane Bradley, the dive supervisor on the surface vessel, responded immediately. "Copy, Bell 1. What's your status?" "We've got an anomaly on sonar, 900 feet below us. Requesting permission to investigate." There was a pause, longer than it should have been. When Shane came back, his voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before. "Describe the anomaly." Caleb chose his words carefully. "Geometric structure, 180 feet diameter, producing thermal signatures inconsistent with ambient depth temperature." Another pause. Then, "Stand by, Bell 1. Feet. The four of them waited in the cramped diving bell, breathing recycled air, listening to the hum of life support systems, while 9,000 feet of dark water pressed against the titanium hull from every direction. Shane's voice returned after what felt like an eternity, but was actually 7 minutes. And when he spoke, there was something different in his tone, something tight and controlled. "Bell 1, authorization granted for descent to 9,100 feet. You have 6 hours to complete depressurization protocol. Document everything, every reading, every visual, every measurement. Understood?" Caleb confirmed, but the question gnawed at him. Why had Shane needed 7 minutes to authorize what should have been a simple yes or no decision? Who had he been talking to? The depressurization process began immediately. Sienna adjusted the heliox mixture, increasing the helium ratio to account for the additional pressure they'd encounter at the new depth. The gas mix had to be precise, oxygen percentage dropping from 18% to 12% to prevent toxicity at extreme pressure. Too much oxygen at depth, and their central nervous systems would seize. Too little, and they'd suffocate despite breathing. Ethan monitored the bell's structural integrity readings while Maya tracked their physiological responses, watching for early signs of high-pressure nervous syndrome. 6 hours of gradual adjustment, their bodies slowly adapting to pressure that would crush an unprotected human in seconds. They ate pre-packaged meals, checked and rechecked equipment, and waited. At hour 5, Sienna noticed the first anomaly in the water temperature readings. The external thermometer showed 34 degrees, standard for this depth, but as they descended past 8,500 feet, the number ticked upward. 35 degrees, 37, 41. By the time they reached 8,900 feet, the water temperature outside the bell registered 52 degrees Fahrenheit. Ethan pulled up the thermodynamic models on his tablet, comparing what they were seeing to what should be physically possible. "This doesn't make sense. Cold water is denser. It sinks. Warm water rises. We should be getting colder as we descend, not warmer." But the readings kept climbing. 56 degrees, 61. At 9,000 feet, the thermometer showed 68 degrees, a full 34 degrees warmer than it should be. The lights came on at 9,080 feet. Not their lights. The bell's external floods were already active, cutting through the absolute darkness that existed this deep. These were different lights, coming from below. A blue-green luminescence that pulsed in rhythm, 8-second intervals, the same pattern they detected on sonar. Caleb maneuvered the bell downward, slowly, using the thrusters to maintain stable descent. The structure materialized out of the darkness like something from a fever dream. A perfect disk, 180 feet in diameter, metallic surface partially buried in sediment but clearly artificial. The metal, if it was metal, didn't reflect their floods the way normal materials should. Instead, it seemed to absorb the light and re-emit it in that same pulsing pattern, as if the structure itself was breathing. Sienna zoomed the external camera to maximum magnification, focusing on the surface composition. The material appeared smooth from a distance, but close inspection revealed microscopic patterns, geometric shapes nested within geometric shapes, fractals repeating at smaller and smaller scales. Ethan deployed the spectrometer, aiming its laser at the structure's surface and waiting for the elemental analysis. The device hummed, processing, and then displayed results that made him check the calibration 3 times. The composition readout showed elements with atomic numbers that didn't exist on the periodic table. Element 143, element 157, element 191. The highest naturally occurring element was 92, uranium. Anything beyond that was synthetic, created in particle accelerators, and unstable, decaying in microseconds. This material was reading as stable and abundant. At the center of the disk, a circular opening, 40 feet in diameter, glowed with that blue-green light. Caleb positioned the diving bell directly above it, close enough that the bell's camera could see inside. The opening descended vertically, a shaft or tunnel leading deeper into whatever this structure was. The light pulsed from somewhere below, illuminating walls that appeared solid, but somehow translucent, like frosted glass or crystallized water, except they were 9,000 feet underwater, where nothing crystallized. Maya checked the biomonitors again, and her voice went quiet. "Caleb, all 4 of us are showing elevated heart rates. Not dangerous, but synchronized. Our hearts are beating in rhythm with those pulses." That's when the electrical systems started failing. Not all at once, but in sequence, as if something was methodically testing their equipment. The primary radio cut to static. The backup radio followed. The navigation computer flickered, and then the depth gauge stopped making sense entirely. It read negative 12,400 feet, then jumped to negative 15,000 feet. Depths that didn't exist anywhere on Earth. While the bell remained stationary, hovering directly above the opening. They hadn't descended. But according to their instruments, they were suddenly 3 miles deeper than the deepest point in any ocean. Caleb made a decision that violated every protocol he'd ever learned, but the instruments were already useless, the radio was dead, and they were suspended above something that shouldn't exist. He looked at Sienna and said what they were all thinking. "Launch the ROV." The remotely operated vehicle sat in its deployment rack on the bell's exterior, a $15,000 piece of equipment with a 500-foot tethered cable and a high-definition camera that could function in absolute darkness. Sienna's fingers moved across the control panel, releasing the mechanical clamps, and the ROV descended into the opening, its lights cutting down through that blue-green luminescence. The cable spooled out. 50 feet, 80 feet, 100 feet. At 140 feet, the ROV should have reached the bottom of any normal shaft or tunnel at this diameter, but the cable kept going. Sienna adjusted the camera angle, and the monitor showed what lay below them. The walls of the corridor were impossible, appearing solid yet somehow translucent, like looking through thick ice, except ice couldn't exist under this pressure. The walls were covered in symbols, intricate geometric patterns that glowed with their own light. But these weren't carved or painted onto the surface. They were moving, flowing across the walls like living things, rearranging themselves in patterns that almost looked like language, like writing, except no human language used shapes that folded in on themselves in dimensions that shouldn't exist. The ROV descended deeper. 200 feet. 240 feet. The corridor opened into something larger. The spherical chamber appeared on the monitor, and all 4 of them stopped breathing at the same time. The space was enormous, at least 300 feet in diameter, a perfect sphere hollowed out beneath the ocean floor. At the center, suspended without any visible support, floated an object that made Ethan's engineering mind revolt against what his eyes were seeing. A sphere, 80 feet across, rotating slowly on an axis that shifted as they watched. Its surface looked like liquid mercury, rippling and flowing, but it maintained perfect geometric form despite appearing liquid. The sphere pulsed, contracting slightly and expanding, contracting and expanding. And Sienna pulled up the timing data. 72 beats per minute. The exact rhythm of a resting human heartbeat. Maya's voice was barely a whisper. "It's alive." But Ethan shook his head, still trying to rationalize what couldn't be rationalized. "It's not alive. It's operational. This is technology we don't understand." The ROV moved closer, its camera focusing on the sphere's surface, and that's when they saw the reflections. Except they weren't reflections of the ROV or the camera or the surrounding chamber. The sphere's surface showed other places. One section displayed what looked like the ocean surface, sunlight penetrating blue water from above, but the angle was wrong. The light quality didn't match anywhere near the Mariana Trench. Another section showed a completely different underwater landscape. Bioluminescent creatures that didn't match any known species, swimming through structures that looked technological. A third section showed the interior of something massive, corridors of light stretching into distance, scale impossible to determine. Then the sphere looked at them. There was no other way to describe it. The surface rippled, reformed, and created something that resembled an eye, large and dark and focused, tracking the ROV's position with deliberate attention. The eye contracted, focusing, and in that moment, Maya gasped because her biomonitor screen lit up with alerts. All four of their heart rates had spiked simultaneously, jumping from 72 beats per minute to 112. And then something happened that the medical readouts would later show, but none of them felt in the moment. Their hearts stopped. All four of them. 4 seconds of complete cardiac arrest, synchronized to the millisecond. And then their hearts restarted, dropping back to 72 beats per minute, as if nothing had occurred. The cable jerked. Not from current, not from drift, but pulled. The ROV camera spun wildly as something yanked the tether with force that should have been impossible in water, force that snapped the reinforced cable like thread. And the video feed cut to black. 500 feet of military-grade cable, rated for 2,000 pounds of tension, snapped. Sienna stared at the blank monitor, her hands frozen on the controls, and then every system in the diving bell came back online at once. Lights, radio, navigation, all functioning as if they'd never failed. Shane's voice exploded through the speakers before Caleb could even key the transmit button. "Bell 1, this is topside. Navy SEALs. Deep Submergence Unit is 90 minutes from your position. Begin ascent immediately. This is not a request. Direct orders from Commander Submarine Force Pacific. Surface, now." Caleb's mouth went dry. They'd never reported the discovery. Their radio had been dead for the last 43 minutes. So how did the Navy know where they were and what they'd found? The ascent took 18 hours, not because they wanted it to, but because saturation diving decompression couldn't be rushed without killing them. Their bodies had adapted to pressure at 9,000 feet. Nitrogen and helium dissolved into their blood and tissues at ratios that would expand catastrophically if they surfaced too quickly. The bends would be the least of their problems. At this depth, rapid decompression meant embolisms, seizures, death. So they rose slowly, incrementally reducing pressure inside the diving bell, breathing gas mixtures that shifted composition every few hundred feet. While Caleb tried to make sense of what Shane had said, the Navy knew. Commander Submarine Force Pacific, the officer responsible for all submarine operations in the Pacific Ocean, had given direct orders for a geological anomaly, for a discovery that hadn't been reported. Maya spent those 18 hours reviewing the biomonitor logs, her medical training making her meticulous about data, and at hour 14 she found something that made her call everyone to look at her screen. The cardiac data showed clear as day. Hour 6 of their dive, at exactly the moment the sphere had focused on the ROV camera, all 4 of their hearts had stopped. Complete cardiac arrest. 4.0 seconds. Synchronized. Then restart. Back to 72 beats per minute. "This should have killed us," Maya said, her voice clinical but her hands shaking slightly. 4 seconds without heartbeat means 4 seconds without blood flow to the brain. You lose consciousness in 6 to 8 seconds. But none of us felt anything. We were all alert, talking, watching the monitor. How is that possible? Ethan pulled up his own biometric data, confirming what Maya had found. We should have blacked out instantly, or at minimum felt dizzy, disoriented. I remember that moment clearly. I was focused on the sphere's surface pattern, trying to identify the material composition. Normal cognitive function. Full consciousness. Sienna nodded, her memory of those 4 seconds equally clear. Whatever had stopped their hearts had somehow maintained their brain function through a period that should have been medically impossible. The implications sat heavy in the cramped bell while they continued their slow journey toward the surface. When they finally breached at hour 18, the sky was overcast and the Pacific swells rolled at 6 feet. But that wasn't what made Caleb's stomach drop. The USS Michael Mansour sat 300 yards off their starboard side, a Zumwalt-class destroyer that cost $4.4 billion and looked like something from a science fiction film. All angular stealth geometry and advanced weapon systems. It was the kind of ship the Navy deployed for high-level threats, and it was here, in the middle of the Pacific, for what was supposed to be a cable maintenance operation. Rigid-hulled inflatable boats launched from the destroyer, carrying men in dive suits who moved with the practiced efficiency of special operations. They boarded the support vessel before Caleb and his team had even exited the decompression chamber, and by the time the 4 divers emerged, still weak and disoriented from 23 days of pressurization, military personnel were already confiscating their equipment. The officer in charge never gave his name. He wore no insignia, no rank markers, nothing that would identify him beyond Navy stenciled on his gear. He informed them that the coordinates they'd been working were now classified as a national security exclusion zone, retroactive to 2011. Their contract with Pacific Link Subsea Incorporated was terminated effective immediately due to discovery of geological hazard. All data, recordings, and equipment would be retained for analysis. They would each receive full payment for the contract period, plus an additional compensatory amount to be determined. They were not to discuss the dive with anyone. Standard non-disclosure agreements would be provided for signature. The entire briefing took 11 minutes, delivered in monotone, and then the officer left. Caleb tried calling Pacific Link Subsea the next day from his hotel in Guam. The number went to a disconnected line. The company's website was gone. Business registration searches showed no entity by that name, current or dissolved. But Caleb had the signed contract in his possession, 23 pages of legal language with corporate seals and signatures. He had the deposit record, $180,000 wired to the team's shared account on February 2nd, 2023. He had email chains stretching back 4 months, technical specifications, mission parameters, safety protocols, all from a company that apparently had never existed. That's when Caleb started digging. If someone was willing to create a fake company, run a legitimate-looking operation for 6 months, pay nearly $200,000, and deploy a $4 billion destroyer to clean up afterward, then this wasn't about one anomaly in one trench. This was bigger. He started with the obvious question: had anyone else found something in the Mariana Trench? The answer came from a source Caleb never expected. 3 weeks after returning stateside, an encrypted email arrived in his inbox from an address that would be defunct within 24 hours. No message, just an attachment. 73 pages of classified documents with NOAA headers, Department of Defense watermarks, and redactions that still left enough visible to change everything. The documents detailed something called the Thalassa Array, named after the Greek goddess of the sea, and what Caleb read in those pages made the Mariana discovery feel like finding one piece of a puzzle he hadn't known existed. The structure they'd found wasn't unique. It wasn't even rare. There were 7 of them. The coordinates were listed in clinical detail. Mariana Trench at 11 degrees 22 minutes north, 142 degrees 35 minutes east. Puerto Rico Trench at 19 degrees, 47 minutes north, 66 degrees 31 minutes west. Japan Trench at 36 degrees 11 minutes north, 142 degrees 43 minutes east. Romanche Fracture Zone in the Atlantic at 0 degrees 13 minutes north, 18 degrees 26 minutes west. Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean at 7 degrees 18 minutes south, 72 degrees 25 minutes east. Philippine Trench at 10 degrees 38 minutes north, 126 degrees 36 minutes east. Ross Sea near Antarctica at 77 degrees 32 minutes south, 173 degrees 43 minutes west. All of them at depths exceeding 8,000 feet. All of them producing identical thermal signatures. All of them displaying the same geometric construction, 180 feet in diameter, same impossible materials, same pulsing blue-green luminescence. Caleb plotted the coordinates on a global map, and the pattern emerged immediately. The 7 structures, when connected, formed a geometric shape that couldn't be natural. An irregular heptagon, with sides that maintained proportional distances despite spanning different oceans. The ratios were exact. The distance from Mariana to Japan Trench divided by the distance from Puerto Rico to Romanche was 1.618, the golden ratio that appeared in nature but never at planetary scale. This wasn't geology. This was placement. Deliberate, calculated, engineered placement by something with the capacity to position identical structures across 7 oceans in a pattern that only became visible when viewed from orbital height. The documents went deeper. The first structure had been discovered in 1996 by the USS Jimmy Carter, a Seawolf-class submarine conducting classified reconnaissance. 28 years of continuous monitoring. 28 years of a program that consumed $4.8 billion annually, buried in Department of Defense budgets under oceanographic research and deep-sea asset protection. D. Satellite imagery with thermal overlays showed all 7 sites under constant surveillance. Sensor networks deployed in concentric rings around each location, collecting data every second of every day. The documents referenced activity signatures, baseline measurements established in 1997, and then the line that made everything urgent. Activity across all 7 sites increased 340% between 2020 and 2023. Recommendation: maintain continuous surveillance. Escalate to Commander-in-Chief level if activity reaches 500% baseline. The final pages detailed what happened to the other witnesses. Sienna Park had signed the non-disclosure agreement within 48 hours of returning to shore, accepting a payment amount that was redacted but followed by 6 zeros. Ethan Cross signed 3 days later. Same arrangement. Maya Torres held out for a week, consulting with a lawyer who advised her that fighting the classification would cost more than she'd ever make and accomplish nothing. She signed. But Caleb had refused. The documents noted his refusal with clinical precision, followed by the consequences. Commercial diving certification revoked for violation of safety protocols during deep saturation operation. Blacklisted from every major subsea contractor in the industry. Applications rejected, references ignored, reputation systematically destroyed. The message was clear: cooperate or become unemployable. But Caleb had kept copies of everything. The sonar data showing the structure, the thermal readings, the biomonitor logs proving their synchronized cardiac arrest, the ROV footage from those final minutes before the cable snapped. All of it stored in multiple locations, encrypted, backed up, insurance against being completely silenced. He couldn't work in the industry anymore, but he could document what he'd seen, and the documents from his anonymous source confirmed he hadn't been wrong or crazy. He'd found exactly what the government had been monitoring for nearly 3 decades. The final page of the leaked documents was dated October 24th. Seismic monitoring stations near all 7 structure sites had detected unusual activity patterns. Low-frequency acoustic signatures at 72 Hz, the exact frequency of a human heartbeat, emanating from depths that should be geologically silent. The pulses had started small, barely detectable above background noise, but they were growing stronger. The most recent measurements showed the structures producing coordinated signals, synchronized across 7 locations separated by thousands of miles, as if communicating, or as if something was waking up. What the portals connected to, Caleb never learned. What purpose they served, what built them, what lay on the other side of those impossible reflections the ROV had captured, remained unanswered. But the activity was increasing. The pulses were getting stronger. And somewhere, buried in classified programs that cost billions of dollars a year, people with access to information Caleb would never see were watching those structures very carefully, waiting to see what would happen when the activity reached 500% baseline, waiting to see what would come through.